And welcome back. It's 21 minutes after the hour of 6 o'clock. You're inside the No Morning Show. I am Natalie Legore, and our spotlight is on vaccination. And here to speak with us about that is Dr. Asha Williams, a Trinbagonian living out there, just doing the best that she can, a biochemical engineer. And she's just here to talk to us about, what vaccine should we use? What are the differences between the vaccines and so much more? So let me pause and say, good morning to you, Dr. Asha Williams.
Good morning, Natalie. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you so much. So tell us a little bit before we get into the vaccine. Where in Trinidad and Tobago are you from?
So I originally am from Trinidad and Tobago. I grew up mostly in the Arima area. I attended Lockett's North Government Primary School. Then I attended St. Augustine Girls High School. Then I moved to New York to pursue my bachelor's in chemical and biomolecular engineering. I have some Jamaican connection. My dad is Jamaican. I know you are Jamaican as well.
I am.
Yeah, but I was born and raised in Trinidad.
Okay, nice. So biomolecular engineering. So tell us, you've worked with the development of vaccines?
Right. So currently, I'm a presidential postdoctoral fellow at Cornell University, and my research is focused at developing a new method of manufacturing vaccines against emerging pathogens. So the ultimate goal is to increase the access of vaccines in parts of the world that are low income or, isolated by using a cell-free system instead of the traditional methods of producing these vaccines. So I'm involved in vaccine manufacturing, vaccine development.
Right. Well, that's very interesting because, there's so much talk about what vaccine should I use. So let's get a little bit into the differences between the vaccine, between the Sinopharm or the Moderna and the Pfizer and the AstraZeneca. Mm-hmm. We hear so much about, the Johnson and Johnson, the AstraZeneca, possibly causing blood clots and not the others. So let's start with the Sinopharm vaccine. What's the basis of the Sinopharm vaccine?
So the Sinopharm vaccine is what you would call a traditional type of vaccine. It's an inactivated virus that, they essentially grow up a bunch of coronavirus. They inactivate it by treating it with a chemical, which ensures that it's no longer infectious. It can no longer replicate in the body. You're essentially exposing your body to a dead version of the virus so that your body can prepare itself to fight the virus if you do become infected in the future. And if you've taken vaccines like measles, mumps, rubella, those are all inactivated viruses. So, you've already had this vaccine before at some point.
Right. And what of the AstraZeneca? How does that compare to the Sinopharm?
The AstraZeneca vaccine is similar to Johnson & Johnson in terms of the technology. It's what you would call a viral vector vaccine. So essentially they use another virus that causes the common cold, but they remove all of the components that make it harmful or dangerous or replicating in your body. And they instead put in genetic material for the spike protein of the coronavirus. So I tell people it's a delivery system. You can think of it as a car where you remove all of the parts, but you take that shell of the car to use as a vehicle to get that material into the cells of your body. And once that genetic material gets in there, it's sort of like a recipe card that gives your cells instructions on how to make this particular spike protein that's associated with the coronavirus. And your immune system detects that and produces antibodies that will protect you against infection. So you can essentially identify the virus if you come into contact with it in the future.
So you don't get the virus, but you're introduced to genetic material that tells you how to make the spike protein of the virus?
Yeah, correct.
And your body now is supposed to be able to recognize that and mount a response.
Right. And this is something that our bodies do regularly on a day-to-day basis. If there's ever a foreign substance that enters the body, your immune system goes on alert, tells your body, this isn't supposed to be here. You have antibodies and different white blood cells that are produced to attack whatever is invading, but also to store a memory of it for future use, like, a circulating mugshot that your body keeps a record of if this thing ever comes into your system again.
Right. And what of the Pfizer and the Moderna?
So Pfizer and Moderna also are similar in the sense that they also introduce genetic material, but they're introducing mRNA instead of DNA. So the flow of our genetic material, it goes from DNA to RNA to proteins. And this is a one-way street that, it's a process that happens in our bodies on a daily basis again. So the mRNA, again, provides a recipe for our bodies to make this spike protein associated with the surface of the coronavirus. Your body recognizes that it isn't supposed to be there, mounts an immune response, produces antibodies that will protect you against infection if you come into contact with the virus in the future. So
then Dr. Williams, the question then becomes, for those people with autoimmune diseases, is it safe for them to take the Pfizer, Moderna, or the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca?
Yes, so none of these vaccines are live vaccines or replicating vaccines. So there is no risk to an immunocompromised person to get infected with COVID-19 from the vaccines. You cannot get COVID-19 from any of these vaccines. I think people a lot of times are worried about the vaccines being dangerous to someone who's immunocompromised, when the actual concern is that these persons may not mount as great of an immune response, so they might not get as much protection from the vaccines. So that's something that's still being investigated, because within clinical trials, a specific study was not done targeting this group to see how much protection they receive. So if
right, and that's where my interest comes from, because I have an autoimmune disease, and so far, no matter who I've spoken with, I haven't gotten the green light, so to speak, to have this vaccine, because the reality is that to introduce something to my body to mount a response, that's definitely not going to happen. For my body to recognize this, to mount a response to ward it off. It doesn't happen with people with autoimmune disease. So from that angle, is it safe for us then, to take the vaccines, these 4 vaccines that I referred to?
Yeah, so I think in those specific situations, it would depend on the types of medications that you're taking. So for example, if you're taking an immunosuppressant or certain steroids that sort of suppress your immune system, that will reduce the robustness of the immune response that you get from a vaccine, which could in turn lead to reduced protection. So that's something that you would have to discuss with your primary care physician. I know in some cases, I have friends who typically take steroids, but were advised that before getting the vaccine, they just pause their steroidal treatment just to give their body a chance to mount that immune response, and then they can continue taking their medication. But of course, that's something that you would have to discuss with your doctor who's more familiar with your
and what of the Sinopharm vaccine? Because we said that it's an inactivated vaccine, and it's very similar to the other vaccines that we've taken for measles, rubella, that kind of thing. If it's so similar to the traditional vaccine, so to speak, would that be a better option for people who are immunocompromised?
Again, I don't think, or there is no official recommendation on any of these vaccines being better for any particular background of person. So, all of the vaccines do provide some level of protection. It varies depending on age, underlying condition, the variant that's circulating. But in terms of specifically one being recommended over another, there isn't really a specific recommendation when it comes to immunocompromised.
Right. But yet we have the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson that so far have been shown to cause some blood clots. So for these 2 vaccines in particular, who are the people who might be in danger of taking them? I'm just trying to figure if there are groups or classes of people with certain medical conditions that these vaccines could, irritate, so to speak.
Yeah, so when it comes to this condition, thrombosis with thrombocytopenia, we aren't exactly sure of the mechanism. Essentially, in very rare cases, when people take the AstraZeneca or J&J vaccine, it triggers the production of a protein in their bloodstream that causes platelets to stick together, forming blood clots. So you have the clot forming, which is thrombosis, and then you have a low platelet count, which is thrombocytopenia. And the combination of these conditions is that very rare side effect associated with these vaccines. In terms of specific recommendations, there isn't something that says, if you have XYZ condition, you're more likely to have this blood clotting condition. I think generally there is knowledge that it's a very rare side effect associated with the vaccine, but I would also remind people that when it comes to COVID-19 infections, 1 in 100 COVID-19 patients develop some type of blood clotting condition. So you have a much higher chance of developing a blood clot from the actual disease than the vaccine itself.
And I think it's important for people to know that. So in other words, these vaccines are safe. Take the vaccine.
Yeah, the vaccine benefits significantly outweigh risks.
Right. And, when it comes down to vaccine hesitancy, what would you say to those who, are still hesitant about taking the vaccine because they may hear that, okay, here's this person who developed blood clot, or here's this person who died after taking the vaccine. And even though it may not be scientifically proven, is that anecdotal, somebody may have taken the vaccine, any vaccine, and would have died after. What do you say to those people?
I would say to people that these vaccines are being watched very closely by regulatory bodies. I know a lot of people say things like, we're being experimented on, etc. But the experiment portion was actually the clinical trials that happened a year ago on tens of thousands of volunteers that took the vaccine and were watched very closely for, side effects, etc. So I hope that provides some type of comfort for people. I would also point people to, again, look at the danger associated with COVID-19 itself. A lot of people think it's just like, the flu, a common cold, because the symptoms are so similar. But even in mild cases of COVID-19, what we're seeing now is that months after people recover from COVID-19, they're popping up with neurological problems. They're getting loss of taste and smell again. They're having these long-term organ damage. And then you have long COVID, which a lot of people are also experiencing. And that's something that we're still trying to understand. We're still trying to learn about. So a lot of things about this virus is still unknown in terms of its effect on the body, its long-term impact on human health, how it affects the development of children. So it's not something that you want to take a chance with, especially when you have a medical remedy like a vaccine that's easily available to you, that allows your body to prepare itself to fight this virus.
Right. And I think that is so critical for people to understand, because even I was speaking to a friend of mine the other day who had COVID, didn't have it so bad. And she's telling me that even after COVID, she feels like she's hallucinating and she's lost her taste. So let's go into some of the symptoms that people can experience even after surviving and getting over COVID.
Like I said, there's long COVID. You have neurological problems. With men, you have things like erectile dysfunction and male infertility that's now being reported as a side effect. For people who, you have that group of people who get severely ill and are hospitalized, but I'm talking about the group of people who aren't ever sick enough to be hospitalized. There's like 1/3 of that group end up having some form of long-term effect associated with the virus. And that's even if you just have those mild flu-like symptoms for 1 or 2 weeks. So I think that's something people need to be wary of as well. And there was also a very recent study showing that COVID-19 actually affects your brain matter. So it actually changes the structure of your brain. In some patients, they actually lose gray matter in their brain. So it's a very serious illness that we're still learning more about. We don't know much about this disease and this virus, but we do know a lot about these vaccines because of the years of research that were done beforehand to produce the vaccines that we now have.
Right. So for the person who is out there who is thinking, should I not take the vaccine? Just take the vaccine, because at the end of the day, as you said, there's a much higher chance of developing blood clots or thrombosis from COVID-19 than from the vaccine.
Precisely.
Right. And even if I think the points that I wanted to reinforce was that your chances of getting a neurological disorder or blood clots, you get it, there's a higher chance of getting that from COVID itself than from the vaccines. And that even if you have, mild COVID-19 virus, SARS-CoV-2, is that you may have long COVID after, which can affect you in very serious ways. Right.
Yeah. I would just want to add a note that I know there are a lot of people out there who think that, they're young and healthy, their bodies can fight it off, or people who take things like natural supplements, herbal remedies, vitamins to boost their immune system. Those things are all very good, but vaccines essentially provide your immune system with a cheat sheet on how to recognize and fight off a virus. So this is not something that you can get from a natural remedy. This is very specific protection that a vaccine provides that you can't really get from anywhere else. And I use the analogy of a school child. So you can have a child who wears the right uniform, is always on time for school, the teachers really like them. That's someone who, is constantly taking these supplements to boost their immune system. But if you put an exam in front of that child for a class or a subject area that they've never studied and they know nothing about, they aren't going to do well, even if they're the best student. So that's where the vaccines come in terms of preparation.
But concerns about some of the vaccines that introduce mRNA or DNA into the system, that it may change your molecular structure or change, what's going on internally. What do you say to those people? Or are these legitimate concerns?
So the short answer is no. These vaccines do not alter or interact with your DNA in any way. If you look at the mechanism of how these vaccines work, like I said, the genetic material is injected typically into your arm muscle. Those specific cells that receive the vaccine and produce, get the mRNA or the DNA to produce that spike protein, they produce the spike protein, but the genetic material itself is actually broken down by the body within about 72 hours. Again, this is something that the body does on a day-to-day basis. It's a very normal routine process for the body to be involved with. So this is not something that lingers in your body for months or years or anything like that. It's broken down within 72 hours. The spike protein itself is destroyed by your body's immune system. So it's not something that remains in your system to produce any type of long-term impact. And like I said previously, these are non-replicating viruses. So they don't go on to replicate in other cells of your body, which is also why these vaccines won't affect things like fertility.
But Dr. Williams, I think, some of the concerns may come from what we're seeing countries doing, where for some countries, if you've taken some vaccines, you're not eligible to enter the country with those vaccines. So then how does that work? If we know that all vaccines are created equal, why are we seeing countries deciding that you can't enter their territory with certain vaccines?
Yeah, that's, I would say, a political issue. I know there's this perception within the Western world and within Trinidad that the mRNA vaccines like Pfizer, et cetera, are sort of the best of the best. And, if you have that vaccine, it's sort of your passport to the world, but that's not necessarily true in places like China and eastern parts of the world where they actually don't accept Pfizer and those vaccines. So you can't really travel freely in those areas unless you have the Sinopharm or Sinovac vaccine. So it kind of depends on what part of the world you're located in. I think in terms of travel, within the US, I know some people had concerns about Sinopharm, but a lot of students in the US are actually in China. So they receive Chinese vaccines and they're coming back here for school. So it's going to be very difficult for, to try to restrict people's movement based on the type of vaccines that they got.
Do you think we should have a vaccine visa? Because people are talking about that. They think it's just going to come down to you can't travel unless you've been vaccinated against COVID-19.
Yeah, I think some places are most likely going to implement something like that. I know there's the typical testing where you have to provide evidence of a negative COVID-19 test, et cetera. But I think at some point there will be that additional step where you also have to be vaccinated, especially with the circulation of these variants that are emerging where, being vaccinated is sort of the bare minimum in terms of protection.
Right. All right, well, let's see what happens going forward. But Dr. Williams, I
Yeah.
want to thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us this morning. Definitely appreciate it. So do enjoy the rest of your day. And we thank you for speaking with us on the Now Morning Show.
Thanks, Natalie. Take care.
All right. Dr. Asha Williams here talking to us about the vaccine. And remember this, the chances of you getting blood clots and getting any kind of neurological disorder are much greater with COVID-19 than with any vaccine that you can take. And even if you get mild COVID-19 virus, you may end up with long COVID, which may see some neurological disorders, seeing the changing in your brain matter, and so much more. So get vaccinated, don't get COVID-19. We take a break and we'll be back with you.